Saturday night, my mom and dad and I watched it. I remember when I was growing up, and they would have different acts come in. So if you got on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I'll show you some footage of this before we're done. Well, she was not doing all the right things. She was a heroin user, was addicted to heroin. And after recording one night, she went back to her motel room, and she mixed up a batch of heroin that she had been given the day before by a dealer. The dealer didn't know what he was doing. He mixed up too pure of a batch of heroin, too lethal, and she took the heroin and died of a drug overdose at the age of 27. So she was, like many musicians at the time, hooked on drugs. Heroin was kind of the hard drug at that time. She went back to her hotel room after a recording session, mixed up a batch of heroin to take. It was too pure. The guy that sold it to her didn't know what he had, and she died of a heroin overdose. She was just 27 years old at the time. Another musician that's often talked about is Jimi Hendrix. Everybody heard of Jimi Hendrix, very famous guitar player. My understanding is that he played a right-handed guitar, left-handed, backwards. That's how good he was. Well, anyway, he wasn't an automatic success. He had a horrible childhood. Music became kind of a sanctuary for him. He learned to play the guitar himself. Didn't have very much success in school. Ended up dropping out of high school and joining the United States Army in 1961. So he has a horrible childhood, uses music as his sanctuary, drops out of high school, joins the United States Army in 1961, serves until he gets injured in the Army, and he gets released in 1962, comes back, and as all musicians talk about, what did he need? A break. You got to get that break, that musical break. Or it might make a difference being successful or not if you meet somebody. Well, it just so happened that Jimi Hendrix met a guy by the name of Chas Chandler. And Chas Chandler was a famous musician from the rock group The Animals, a 1960s group called The Animals. And Chandler took a liking to Hendrix and became his manager, took him under his wing, and the rest is history, right? The rest is history. Now again, Jimi Hendrix was no different. He had a group, and then he didn't have a group because he wanted to go on his own, then he, that type of thing. And probably his most famous performance was at Woodstock when he played his own rendition, rock rendition of what? Do you know? Yeah, Star Spangled Banner. Very good, national anthem. His own rock rendition of the national anthem. That was probably the most famous. People remember the most about him was his rendition of the Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock. Well, he also had issues with heroin. And as a result of that, on September 18th of 1970, he died of an overdose, also, ironically, at the age of 27. So he and Janis Joplin died at the same age at 27. And we sure remember, I think Janis Joplin probably and Jimi Hendrix are a lot like John Kennedy, much more famous maybe in death than they would have been in life if they would have continued their careers, who knows. But the group that's always been popular from 1960 to the present is our next group of musicians called the Beatles. Now, here's an interesting story for you. What are the Beatles? What does that mean, Beatles? Why are they called the Beatles? What are they referring to?
The bottom.
Well, that's what they want to avoid. They didn't want B-E-E-T. They didn't want to be a bug. Beatles was
Like a
beat.
beat. Oh, like a ball.
The beat, see? And a lot of people thought that the Beatles were they named themselves after a bug like the Animals and stuff. But they said the Beatles because they wanted to emphasize beat, okay? Now, the group started in 1960 with 3 familiar names, not 4. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. And another fellow that was playing drums, but not Ringo Starr. So the group starts in 1960 with John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. They have a gig and their drummer isn't feeling well, can't make it, so they just kind of hired this temp guy by the name of Ringo Starr, and they turn out to like him better than their regular guy, and so the rest is history. Okay? So the Beatles become John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. Now, their first single, Love Me Do, was released in England in September of 1962. Their first single, Love Me Do, was released in England in September of 1962. When it finally got released in the United States in 1964, it immediately shot up to #1 on the American chart. Now you guys are way different than I am, because I grew up in a different area. Well, you know, we paid attention to when I was in high school, the top Billboard Top 100, baby. Every week it'd come out, who's #1, who's #2, made the top 100. And my old buddy Mike Blakesley, down there at Valley Auto and Music, had this special equipment that he could record you a cassette tape. And you could go in there and you could pick songs off the top 100, and he would record them for $7, which was quite a bit of money in those days. For $7, you could pick out any 10 songs you wanted off the Billboard Top 100, and he'd record them on a tape for you. Man, oh man, the old 67 Chevy 2 Nobu with the cassette player was rocking on Saturday nights with Mike Blakesley, okay? Anyway, we used to pay attention to that, so rankings were important. And Love Me Do went to #1 in 1964 as soon as it got into the United States. Well, all of a sudden in '64, the Beatles are known in the U.S. And in February of 1964, guess where they performed for the first time in America? No? What television show? The Ed Sullivan Show. That was like the biggest deal ever. They estimated that either live or mainly on TV, 73 million people watched the Beatles' debut on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I'm going to show it to you. I'm going to show you a video. It's going to take us to class period on the 50th anniversary of that show, in which they come back, 3 of the 4 that are living, and they have a concert, and all your favorite artists like Alicia Keys and Adam Levine or Levine or whatever his name is, and John Legend and all these, Katy Perry, are all singing these Beatles songs in front of the surviving Beatles. It's cool. And they go back and reminisce about their time at the Ed Sullivan Show, and they go back to the studio, and people, girls that were screaming in the crowd, they interview 50 years later. I'm going to show you that before the week's out. It's really cool. It's really cool. You'll like it. But anyway, they were on the Ed Sullivan Show. By April of 1964, they had 5 singles in the top 100. That's pretty amazing. 5 of their songs were ranked in the top 100 Billboard chart. 5 singles. And they became so hot that people referred to the love of the Beatles as Beatlemania. Beatlemania became the thing in the United States. Girls passing out when they go watch them live. I mean, they were heartthrobs and people going crazy and screaming. You'll be amazed when you see this video. But Beatlemania struck across the country, and they became very, very popular. And they played at Shea Stadium in August of 1965. 55,000 people packed into Shea Stadium in New York to watch. Did I ever show you that Billy Joel playing We Didn't Start the Fire? That was at Shea Stadium, by the way. That's kind of an important venue. 55,000 people packed into Shea Stadium in August of '65. And they became so popular, this caused a lot of controversy. John Lennon, after that concert, stated publicly in an interview that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ. And I'll tell you, church groups went crazy. People that were offended started burning their albums, bonfires. John Lennon said in an interview that he believed that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ. And I think people took offense to that, and they were burning their albums and everything else. But he probably had a point to a point. They were very, very popular. What people don't know about the Beatles is their run together lasted less than 10 years. And their last public concert together was in August of 1966. They were starting to get their own philosophies, and in August of '66, they played at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. And they only played like a half hour. They were kind of just starting to get dysfunctional at that point. And they decided they better try something different, so they actually went to India and studied Transcendental Meditation in India. They got together and started thinking, we better see if we can get our problems worked out. So in 1968, they went to India to study Transcendental Meditation. And they returned back to the United States and they signed with a new record label. They started their own. Before they were kind of owned by somebody, they started their own record label called Apple Records. Now if you look at a Beatles record, it has an apple inside. Okay?
I have two of the vinyls.
There you go. You see the apple? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in November of 1968, they completed their first ever, double album. What is that? A double album. Two records, and a lot of songs. And it was simply called The Beatles, or most importantly referred to as the White Album. This thing is worth a lot of money. You don't find these white albums. And if you found one in mint condition, this one would probably not be very mint. Thousands and thousands of dollars. And this is their double album. It has two, and see what it has in the middle? An apple. So, I'll pass this around. Please do not take the records out of here. And this is known simply in history. I just screwed it up. This is known in history simply as the Beatles, and if you look on it, it's kind of indented here, it just says the Beatles, but it's more known in rock history as the White Album. Double album, 1968. Well, I would just tell you this, that disputes and disagreements and disharmony among the band members started to happen, and it really was bad during the making of this album. They just didn't get along at all. And finally, in September of 1969, John Lennon simply told the group he was going to be done. He was going to leave the group, and they couldn't. Could they be the Beatles without all four of them? No. So officially, in April of 1970 is when the Beatles broke up and really never got together much again. What did they do? Embarked on their own solo careers. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Okay? So, again, disagreements, disputes, disharmony began to happen, especially during the making of the White Album. And in September of 1969, John Lennon told the band he was leaving, and the band officially broke up in April of 1970. All four went on to carry on successful careers. Now I'm going to tell you about each one and what he did. Okay? We'll talk about John Lennon first. John Lennon. Between 1970 and 1980, he released 7 albums. 7. That's quite a few in a 10-year period. So John Lennon, between 1970 and 1980, he released 7 albums. He was murdered outside his New York City apartment in December of 1980 at the age of 40. As he was walking home, a guy asked him for his autograph. When he stopped to give it to him, he shot him to death. Now, you know, I'll never forget that. Let me tell you why. You know what I was doing that day? I was working as a part-time sports writer during college at the Billings Gazette. And we're watching Monday Night Football. Who was the main speaker for Monday Night Football back in those days? Anybody know? You ever heard the name Howard Cosell? Well, Howard Cosell was like the man for Monday Night Football. I will never forget it. We are watching Monday Night Football as we are doing the sports. And Howard Cosell breaks the game and he says, I've got disturbing news. John Lennon has been shot and killed outside his apartment in New York City. I couldn't believe it. I heard it live. And that's what happened to him. That happened in December of 1980 on a Monday night. Shot right outside his New York City apartment at the age of 40. It was crazy. How about George Harrison? What happened to George Harrison? During his career, he released a dozen solo albums. A dozen. And he also got into the production of films. He became a film producer as well. So he released a dozen albums during his career after the Beatles, so to speak, and became a film producer as well. He died of cancer at the age of 58 in November of 2001. He died of cancer at the age of 58 in November of 2001. So 2 of the 4 are dead. Ringo Starr. He had a really successful single career, so to speak. He released over 24 albums. And he also got into film as actor. He became kind of an actor. And he also appeared in, probably the same number, probably 24 films he was in during his life. So he was very successful. His band was called the All-Star, like, Ringo Starr Band. So he started his own band called the All-Star Band, and he did quite well. 24 albums during his life, also probably was in that many films.
Was there 2 R's on that?
Yeah, just like his name, All-Star Band. Paul McCartney, probably the most famous maybe of the Beatles, and he's been the most successful ex-Beatle ever, and he did everything kind of as a solo artist. He formed a band with his late wife, Linda, called the Wings, Paul McCartney and the Wings, which are still active today. Paul McCartney and the Wings. He continues to tour. Ringo Starr doesn't tour a lot. He just kind of does special events like the one I'm going to show you. But Paul McCartney's on tour. Man, in fact, I just saw something on Facebook where he's going to be in maybe Missoula or something, Montana or something. Now, according to the Guinness World Book of Records, he's the most successful musician, songwriter in world history. According to the Guinness Book of Records, Paul McCartney is the most successful musician, songwriter in American history. Okay, I think what we're going to do here is I think that we're going to, tomorrow I'm going to dedicate the period to showing you this. I just really think it's important you see this Beatles 50 years later. I think you'd enjoy it. So we'll watch that tomorrow. I do want to continue. We got, how much we got here? 6 minutes, we'll maybe stop. We'll have to finish up fashions in the 1960s, and we also have to finish up Marilyn Monroe. But I really think this video is worth watching, so we will see that tomorrow.